Kia ora everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Untidy. I'm Hannah Davison. I'm the co-founder and author of the My Big Moments children's books. I'm the mother to two, and I have one podcast hound asleep on my slipper as we speak. And I just had to check with Maddie before if she could hear her snoring, which apparently she could. So we might need to change that. But I'm here with my lovely co-host,
Matilda Green. I'm a content creator, mum of 3 children and one little Jack Russell. And today on the show, we have a very special guest, none other than the brilliant Susie Ferguson. So Susie has a new autobiography out called Bloody Minded. And oh my gosh, Susie, you have lived quite the life, which we will get into soon. But Susie was born in Scotland, now lives in New Zealand with her husband Lee and 2 kids. Susie has been a drama student, a war correspondent, and most recently is the host of Saturday Morning on RNZ, all while battling endometriosis, which we will do a deep dive on very soon. But first of all, a very warm welcome to you, Susie.
Kia ora, thanks so much for having me on. And I also have a podcast hound, a black schnoodle, who will probably start barking at some point that's really inconvenient.
Perfect.
Oh,
we
lovely.
welcome all. All of the fur babies are welcome, mainly because we can't get rid of them. So everybody's in, babies, dogs, you name it.
Yep.
Listeners will not know this, but actually I was born in Scotland as well. So yeah, I know. I was born in Edinburgh. We had a farm out in East Lothian and moved out here when I was 3.
Wow. I guess you don't remember much about that time?
Funnily enough, I remember quite a bit, I think, because there was such a contrast. A contrast in the environment. So I remember a lot about our house and the farm and, the garden and that sort of stuff, snow, because there was that contrast. I think if I'd grown up and been all the same, I wouldn't be able to differentiate that early time from later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I've exercised my dual citizenship a bit, which has been nice. It's less of a flex now, but it's still good.
Less, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, Susie, you've just released your book, Bloody Minded, which is published by HarperCollins. It's a deeply personal account of your life, and there's so much in there. It's so broad, and it's fascinating, and also beautifully written. So, congratulations on.
It's a wonderful book.
Yeah, what would have been a lot of hard graft. And you've talked a lot about your struggle with endometriosis, which we want to talk about because it's something actually we haven't covered yet really on the pod. And I understand 1 in 10 women are affected.
Yeah, something like that. It's kind of a terrifying number when you think about it like that, because you kind of think, oh, so I will have, friends or a sister or a cousin or an auntie or, everyone will know, probably multiple people who've got endo. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot. But I understand you swore that you would never write a book. So what motivated you to share your story?
Yeah, I always say, there are 3 things. I would never climb Everest, I would never run a marathon, and I would never write a book. I was never going to write a book, and I'm not doing the other 2.
I was going to say, is this a trifecta now? You're just going to tick everything off?
No. I have no desire to do either of the other 2. I don't know. I was leaving Morning Report, which had been a kind of an all-consuming job in some ways, and it came from funnily enough, a podcast interview that I did when I was leaving that show sort of 2 and a bit years ago. And off the back of the interview in this podcast called Recovering, 2 different publishers came to me and said, we think there's a story here. And despite saying I would never write a book, I'd had a couple of situations which had never quite come to anything, but had ended up basically with me writing bits of my experiences, some of my stories, particularly, I guess, from the war in Iraq, sort of 2003, and being a war reporter. And one of my friends reading it and saying, I've never read anything like this before. I don't know any of these stories. And so that had kind of, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, planted a bit of a seed that maybe there was a story there to write. And then, when I was kind of approached by the publishers and had some conversations, and in a way they were quite affirming, where you think, oh, no, maybe there is something here. Maybe there is a story. So I thought I'd give it a go.
Well, and I think it's worked.
Thanks.
Yeah, I really do. And I was really struck by how many times you were just so brutally honest and so raw in the book, and often about topics that can be shrouded in silence. And I think that's so important. The realities of living with the extreme pain of endometriosis and how you managed at work and being gaslit by medical professions, just throughout for decades. And then of miscarriages and difficult early days with your baby. And it was so refreshing. It was such a relief actually to read, because so many of these things are just sort of kept behind closed doors, or, we feel like we're not supposed to talk about them, and we're not supposed to have those feelings. But how important was it for you to really use your voice and speak up and be really honest about all of this?
Oh, I think this kind of stuff is really important, because in all those sorts of different areas, and things like miscarriage. Like when I first got pregnant, it sounds really naive, but it didn't even cross my horizon that I might have a miscarriage. And it's not the way that we talk about it. If someone's pregnant, it's kind of like, oh, and the first thing is like, this is your due date. So you're like, okay, I know when it's going to happen. And there's this automatic assumption that there will be a baby, all is going to go well. Where people get really uncomfortable talking about any of the kind of difficult sides of this sometimes. And the result of all of this is that my experience was that I felt really isolated in quite a lot of these circumstances that you were just talking about. Like with miscarriage, I had a kind of, in a way, I do think this is quite fortunate that I actually ended up having to tell people, because we'd organized to have a New Year party, and my 12-week point was just after then. It was sort of early January. And so because, I was bouncing along in I've got my positive pregnancy test, it's all going to happen, I know when I'm going to have a baby kind of bubble. I thought, oh, well, it's all fine. I'll just tell people and then they'll know. And then it'll explain why I'm not drinking at my own party in my own house on New Year. And I don't have to pretend with anybody. And it was such a crash down to earth when, I think it was on about the 4th of January, I was back at work, and I told my boss, because at the time I was a war correspondent, and flak jackets don't come in maternity sizes. So I needed to tell her pretty early on that I wasn't going to be able to go to some of the places that I had been going to. And when I started spotting at work, she was amazing, and just kind of completely, pulled it together and went, you need to go home, you need to get a doctor's appointment, you need to rest, just go away and do all these things, and just let me know how you go. And it hadn't occurred to me that there would be a problem. I was just like, oh, it's probably just some spotting. And then, and that unfolds over sort of a few days, because it ended up being a Friday. And then, you couldn't get into the early pregnancy clinic for a scan or any of that kind of stuff until the Monday. But even still, over that weekend, nothing actually happened to me. And so when the miscarriage started, and it was pretty brutal, and I ended up hemorrhaging and in hospital because I was losing so much blood. I did end up, once, I got home and it was all kind of finished and done with, I had a lot of people that I had to ring up because they'd been at this party, a week earlier, to say, oh, actually, this has happened. And I wouldn't have told people if it hadn't been for the party, which then would have meant I wouldn't have had anybody to talk about this with, because if you silence something, it becomes shameful. And there's so much around, if you're a woman, then if you're wanting to have children, then it's about being able to have children. And if you can't, if it's not straightforward for you in any kind of way, that can immediately become potentially, in some ways, your dirty little secret that actually isn't for you to keep. And it means you grieve for something which is not the kind of grief that certainly I'd ever experienced before. And I remember a friend saying, it's not the grief for something that's been, it's the grief for something that could have been. It's for your hopes of being a parent and your dreams of kind of this next stage of your life. That's what you're grieving for, which made a lot of sense to me and was incredibly helpful. But I suppose particularly with those kinds of things, I don't feel we need to invite any more shame into our lives than we already have.
There's certainly a bit of that floating around, isn't there?
Oh my goodness. And then also, I suppose, just a quick word on the endo side of things. I've had a few colleagues who read the book, who were colleagues of mine when I was in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever. And they're saying, I had no idea this was happening to you. And so there is that sense that if you don't tell people that you're bleeding all the time, or you don't tell people that you're in a huge amount of pain, they might not work that out. And so therefore you're not going to get any help.
Yeah, it was extraordinary reading about, times when you were just trying to manage the pain and do your job at the same time, breaking out in sweat, standing up with like one foot on the desk and bending over so you could somehow get through your work, and having to take opioids for years. When you were in Iraq, you had a bag of pills, and did you say you were taking like 15 a day or something?
Yeah, I mean, it depended on the day, but so I was taking a contraceptive pill, which theoretically I was taking it back to back without a break, which theoretically was meaning that I wasn't going to bleed while I was over there. That did not work for me. But I didn't find that out until I was there. So then it was there were various options that I had when it came to painkillers. I had things like paracetamol and ibuprofen. I then had another step up to a stronger anti-inflammatory painkiller called Ponstan. And then I had opioids, which were a type of paracetamol, or a combination of paracetamol and codeine, that doesn't exist anymore. I don't think. You can still get paracetamol, codeine, but there's something different about it. Anyway, I was on this thing called codidromol, and I could take that up to 4 times a day, and that was potentially 8 tablets I was taking that were opioids. And I mean, that was during the war. And by the time I was over here, there were points that I was taking tramadol when I was working on Morning Report for endo pain. But then presenting, one of the country's foremost news and current affairs shows on tramadol is not great.
No, well, I was going to ask, what were the side effects? How was your mental clarity? Because I've, on the odd occasion, I've had to take codeine or tramadol or something like that. Not great. Like, I didn't
you feel quite odd.
Yeah. So did you get those side effects?
Yeah, you can. I mean, there are definitely times with things like tramadol, there are times that I would feel quite spaced out. So I'd have to try to take it later on in the show. So I often wouldn't take it till maybe 9:15. So at the point it would kick in would actually be after the program. There were a few times that I had to take it before then. I could take 1 rather than 2, depending on the pain. I mean, I guess as well, I've probably got a level of tolerance that is higher than some people's, because I've taken opioids on and off, through a large chunk of my 20s. Less so in my 30s, I guess, because my endo seemed to subside a bit after the excision, after the laparoscopy that I had, the operation to get rid of it. But there's a bunch of things you're not really in a great position to do when you've been taking lots of opioids. Driving, for example, is not necessarily a great idea. I don't know how it works looking after young children, but there have been plenty of times that I've been in a position where I've had to do that, because you're in you're in the bind between the devil and the deep blue sea. Like, which is it going to be? Do you look after your kids, or do you just go to bed? Well, you can't. You have to look after your kids. So there we are.
Yeah.
So it's just needs must, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you feel about having shared, to this level of exposure in the book? Because I sort of think, someone's got to say it, and it felt good that you were saying it. Is that how you feel now, or do you feel exposed having talked about everything that you've talked about in the book?
I don't feel exposed. I actually think there's quite a lot of power in it.
Yeah.
I think, so often, and not to by any means do down, memoirs of war reporters that have been written previously, but a lot of them have been men, and a lot of them don't have some of the experiences that I've had, good and bad. I did read a book quite a few years ago that was by a foreign correspondent, I think of the Times newspaper. She's called Janine de Giovanni. And she wrote about reporting from all sorts of places as a foreign correspondent, while at the same time trying to have a baby. And I remember thinking, that's such a powerful book. And it was the first time I'd read a book that sort of spoke to the experience I was having at the time. I think it's called The Place at the End of the World. It's a really great read. And I think there's an awful lot of power in that, because we do get this sort of idea that, women can do anything and you can have any job you want and, go out and conquer the world. And absolutely women can. But we are doing it in a world that we didn't create. Like, we didn't build the world that we work in and that we live in and that we operate in. And so you do find you find the boundaries, you find those edges in a way that I think men who go out into the world and try to conquer the world don't find the boundaries in the same place. And I find that space interesting as a place to look at and to examine. But I think, there's a lot said about being authentic, I guess. And I suppose I feel it's part of that. Nobody can take my experiences away from me. And there's an awful lot of them that I'm actually really proud of.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way to put it, actually. And I'd like to just rewind a little bit. So before the diagnosis of endometriosis, you speak in the book about your struggle that you had with really heavy and painful periods. So was it always like that from the moment you got your period, or did it kind of develop over time?
I don't really remember my first period, which is, you'd sort of think that I would, but then I've wondered in the sort of thinking back on that time, as I have done, for the book, I wonder if that was because it wasn't that remarkable. Because of course we tend to remember things that are remarkable. And I think maybe the first few were not that big a deal. When I left the UK, I got a copy of my medical notes because they're kind of complicated. So when I knew I was moving to New Zealand, I thought it's going to be useful to have them. And the first time I go to the doctor complaining of bad periods of various kind, whether that's painful or seemingly a lot of blood, I'm 14. And I was 13. I think it was about 13 and a half when I got my period. So, it's not very far into that particular situation that I'm already, 14-year-old Susie's kind of thinking there's something funny going on here. This doesn't seem, in quotes, normal. But then what is normal? Because we often don't talk about how many tampons you might have used up or how many pads or whatever. And I get it. Not everyone wants to discuss that kind of stuff, and that's fine. But I remember telling doctors, like, I'm using a Super Plus tampon and a pad, and I'm having to change it between every lesson at school, which, looking back on it now, I think that's a red flag. That feels like a lot of blood.
Huge.
And you see, I only knew how to quantify stuff like that pretty much at the point that I went into perimenopause. I didn't have the information when I was 14, 15, 16 of how much, if you're changing that often, you can actually work out how much blood you're losing. And so I think that's the difficulty, that my periods were always bad and there didn't seem to be anything I could do to change that. I remember one time going for a run because, at some point I was told that exercise was good and that would help with period pain. Went for a run on a weekend, and I'm not one of nature's runners, hence never run a marathon. But, doing the thing, you're like, I'm doing the right thing, I'm helping myself, I'm, being good to my body, I'm going to get this exercise. I went for a short run and my whole body was screaming in pain by the time I got back, and I had to go and lie down. So, yeah, I don't think they've ever
How
really...
frustrating.
Yeah, really frustrating.
Yeah, because you think, I'm trying my best.
Yeah, no, yeah.
And can you tell us a bit about that internal struggle you felt in your mind about wondering if this was normal and just something as women we should put up with, and if you're just being overly dramatic, which I think that's something that women in particular, we do a lot, don't we? We think maybe it's not a big deal, and maybe I'm just making a big deal of it in my head, and maybe I should just play it down and not focus on it too much. So what was that internal struggle like for you?
Yeah, it's tricky. So my parents were both medical. My dad was a doctor, and so I have a lot of trust, and still do have a lot of trust and sort of faith in doctors. And so the first time, I guess you sort of think, it's a bit weird. I think this is a bit weird. I think there's something going on here that's not, in quotes, normal. And you go to the doctor and they say, well, it'll probably settle down, and everything takes so long. You should probably wait and see what happens over the next 6 months. And, when you're that age, you kind of think, God, this is forever. So you give it time and you kind of wait and you keep thinking, I really don't think this is normal. I don't think this is what's meant to happen. And then I think also it doesn't help when you, at the same sort of time as this happening, was the point that I was thinking, actually, my dream of what I want to do is I want to go to drama school next. So then it's very easy to be labeled dramatic at that point. And hysterical. And I think a lot of people are written off, drama school or not. I think a lot of women are written off as, oh, just being hysterical, just being overdramatic. Like, oh my God, she thinks she's the only person who's ever had a period in her life. You know, I think it's very easy for people to be labeled dramatic or hysterical. And at that point, people stop listening. So if your doctor's then not really listening, maybe not really taking you seriously, maybe thinking you're over egging it a bit. Also, I think there's been an awful kind of, there's like a bit of a wasteland when it comes to the medical research that has been done around this stuff, particularly back in the 90s, which is, I suppose, what I'm talking about. There just wasn't the information, there wasn't and there still isn't really an awful lot of medical research into this area. So normal is a really big expanse. I mean, I was losing so much blood, I was anemic as a teenager. So at that point, you kind of think, well, if you've given me a prescription for iron pills, you know, when I eat meat. It wasn't like it was I didn't eat, I was vegetarian, or I wasn't getting, red meat or whatever. I was eating everything. Then maybe there's a problem here. There's maybe another problem here.
Yeah, it doesn't quite add up, does it? And another thing that strikes me is that the society and culture that we live in, the way that we live, we don't see the blood. You know, that is all hidden away and tucked away. And unless parents are very intentional about going to the toilet in front of their children, and not hiding their period, you don't see it. And so then you've got no comparison either for what's happening
point, actually.
with anybody else and anybody else's bodies.
Or with your friends. It's not something that even if people, like even as teenagers, if you're talking about your periods, you don't really get to see anyone else's experience of a period. I do remember my mum having periods, so it wasn't completely mystified. But then having said that, she had really heavy periods too. She didn't get all the pain. But what I thought of as normal or abnormal, I have no idea whether that's what you would think is normal. It's this kind of shroud of silence that goes on.
And it's the sort of thing that we talk about later, when everyone gets really a lot more comfortable with themselves, and probably also after the point that you have babies and when you have a baby, there's nothing you can do but talk about all of the functions of your body and their body and anything else that's going on. It's unavoidable. But I think you sort of get a lot more comfortable, because everything's out there. You're answering the door while you've got a baby on your boob. And then I think people start talking a lot more about what's happening with their bodies. What was interesting was that your dad was a GP, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So was there any indication from him that, did you talk about it with him much about how much blood you were losing?
Not particularly, I guess. I talked about it more with my mum, I think, which was partly sort of a circumstance thing, because there was a point in my teenage years where my dad was we lived in Scotland, but he was actually working in England and coming back at weekends. And so there just wasn't so much of the time to be able to, just casually ask him of an evening, because he wasn't around in the way that that often your dad might be, I suppose. My mum, I mean, there was definitely an acknowledgement from my mum that there was a lot of blood, and she's an anatomist and used to teach anatomy to medical students in Edinburgh University. So, I mean, she was pretty well versed around this kind of stuff. And she was actually she was the one who kind of encouraged me to go to the doctor in the first place and sort of say, I think you maybe need to check this out and go to the GP. And I don't think I had a bad GP by any stretch. I think I actually had a very compassionate GP as a teenager, but I think there was probably a sense from him that it may well just settle down.
Is that just something they say, though, when they don't have an answer? Because, you know, your journey with it was so long and it was difficult to be taken seriously. There were few options. There seems a reluctance to give you, what would get you an actual diagnosis. It was a long journey through which time,
Yeah.
you physically had to really suffer. And sometimes, they go, oh, I think it will just settle down. It's like, well, you just don't know. That's what you're telling me, is that what you're saying is I don't know.
I think to be fair, they probably didn't know. He did at the time. I think you can buy Ponstan just like in the pharmacy now, but at the time you needed a prescription for Ponstan, or in the UK you did anyway. And so he did prescribe that for me quite early on. I was 15 when I went on the contraceptive pill, which again, theory was that would help to regulate my cycles and I would maybe bleed a bit less, and that would perhaps help with the pain, which I think it did initially. So while those are not amazing treatments, I don't know if endo ever crossed his mind as a diagnosis. It would be interesting to know if it did, because certainly there was no, I was well into my 20s before that was something that was beginning to be talked about. And after a lot of trips to the gynecologist, including one that sort of initially I had a huge ovarian cyst on my left ovary, which may have been an indication that there was something going on, but two and two was never added up at that point.
So could you, for people who aren't familiar with what endometriosis is, would you give us a bit of an explanation? And then how was it ultimately diagnosed for sure?
So endometriosis is a condition where a substance that is similar, although not exact, I don't think, similar to the lining of your uterus, where it grows elsewhere. So typically it grows on your bowel or your bladder or your ovaries, the outside of your fallopian tubes. There are studies that show that endo can get to all sorts of other parts of your body, like your brain, your lungs. People don't see, scientists even don't seem to know how that happens, because we do typically think of it as being pelvic pain that it induces. The curious thing about endo is that sometimes people have heaps of it and no symptoms. And then the other way round, you can have almost no endo and a huge amount of pain. It can cause, I think I'm right in saying, although I'm not a doctor, it can cause higher chance of miscarriage. It can cause difficulty conceiving, but then also the inverse can be true. It's a very curious condition. When I was going through the hospital system, the only way it could be diagnosed was through a laparoscopy, which is where you have an operation. So you're in an operating theatre. It's a sort of keyhole surgery procedure, but it's an expensive thing to diagnose, because you need the anaesthetist and the surgeon and all the nurses and the theatre and the whole thing. I believe now there are beginning to be some scans that people can have that pick up endometriosis, so people can be diagnosed without such an invasive procedure. I don't know an awful lot about that, although I do have a friend who was diagnosed in her 40s with endo that way. That doesn't then get you necessarily the treatment that you need, because the only way to treat it, I think, that we have at the moment is to physically cut it out. So when the surgeon's in there, they see the endometriosis and they excise it. They get rid of it, and that usually involves cutting it out, sometimes lasering it out, depending on where it is. And the pain, because all your organs are all kind of just on top of each other. You kind of think of them as being separate, but they're all kind of on top of each other. So you get quite a lot of overlapping symptoms with other conditions. So there's a really interesting book called Pain and Prejudice by an Australian journalist called Gabrielle Jackson, which came out a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I remember hearing her be interviewed about her findings, because there are about 10 conditions that are very frequently also seen alongside in someone who has endometriosis. And I was driving along listening to this interview and just like mentally ticking them off. I was like, yes, I get migraine. Yes, I get IBS. Yes, I get. And you suddenly thought, oh my God, this makes so much sense. I think I'd had my hysterectomy by the time I was listening to this. Not perhaps necessarily all that useful, but really fascinating to then look back on your time and you go, oh, I remember how I couldn't get out of bed for 2 days. I just thought I was maybe getting the flu or something, but it just didn't turn into anything. Oh, maybe that was my endo all along. So it's got all sorts of curious symptoms. It's kind of a whole body response that can happen as a result of, what looks like your uterus lining getting in the wrong place.
Mm.
God, that's fascinating, isn't it?
It's so complex.
Really complex.
So you got a laparoscopy ultimately to get diagnosed. Yeah.
Yeah, I was 28 when I had the diagnosis. I'd been on a waiting list in the UK with the NHS for about 4 years at that point. I'd been told that I should have a baby because that would cure endometriosis. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. And
It's
also,
also quite the commitment for a treatment, isn't it?
well,
Like you'll be working really hard for at least, 20 years.
maybe it's just that you'll be so tired you don't realize how much pain you're in. I don't know. Yeah, but certainly that was offered up as a treatment at one point to me. I've tried every contraceptive pill I think that is in existence to try to stop the pain. I've taken them back to back. I've taken you do sort of everything to try to do it, but the only thing that actually for me and for most people cured it and meant that I didn't have to take painkillers all the time was the laparoscopy. So I had that when I was 28, and it was life-changing. Yeah.
And you became a war correspondent in 2003 and were sent to Iraq.
Yes.
So what was that like, being the only woman amongst a battalion of men in a scenario like that? I mean, you painted the picture so beautifully in your book, but can you explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, it was a really interesting one. That I became a war correspondent I got a job in February 2003. I think it was the middle of February 2003 as a reporter, and it looked by that point there were already about 250,000 British and American, mainly American troops on the borders of Iraq. And it was very clear that something was going to happen. And I became a war reporter by accident. It wasn't something I'd ever sought. My first week, or my first day, I think it was even, of broadcasting school, when I did my postgrad in broadcast journalism, the tutor said, right, who wants to be a war correspondent? About half the class put their hand up, and one of them wasn't me. I went to this meeting. It's one of those moments where your life changes in an instant. I went to this meeting ahead of what we call now the Iraq War. And the Ministry of Defence in the UK was running what was called an embedding programme, where journalists and reporters and camera operators, photographers were being placed with different bits of the military ahead of what was going to happen. And he literally said, "Oh, do you want to go?" kind of thing. And I was like, yeah, thinking, always say yes. You can always back out of stuff later. And
figure it out later. Yeah.
Figure it out later. And I didn't back out. But I had about 3 weeks from that moment to being in the desert in Kuwait, living out of the back of a thing that's like a small tank with 3 blokes I didn't know. And I ended up with the infantry, which now I think women do serve with the infantry, but I don't know how many. And there was kind of a sprinkling of other women around. So in a lot of the other parts of the military, the logistics, the engineers, the medics, the catering, all these kind of other parts of the military do have women in them. But right at the front line, where the infantry was, it was all men. And it was a really curious thing to do, because you're there, you're completely dependent on these people for your safety, for your day-to-day basics, your food, where to sleep, and at the same time you're reporting on them. But then also you become friends with them. So it's a complex relationship. I remember having a chat with Danny. He was the guy who was the driver in the small tank that I lived in. It was called a Warrior. He was the Warrior driver. And I remember him saying at one point during the war, if you ever see me on the street and I'm with a woman, don't stop and talk. And I found that quite confronting, because I was like, oh, I thought we were mates. Like, I thought he was 22, I think, at the time. So we weren't that dissimilar in age. And he said, my wife doesn't know. She knows that there's a reporter in the wagon, but she doesn't know you're a woman, and that wouldn't be okay. And so initially you realize that some of these people that you're forging these incredibly intense, fast relationships with are not people that you're going to be able to have that relationship with when you step back into your real life, which is fine. But you immediately become aware that this is very much a man's world. And so you end up sleeping next to people, washing next to people. There's no privacy. Going to the toilet in front of people. A whole bunch of the equipment that we had to use wasn't designed for women. So there was a thing called an NBC suit that we all had to wear for the invasion, for going across the border, Kuwait to Iraq, which was, nuclear, biological and chemicals, what the NBC stands for. It sort of felt like stiff cardboard, the suit. And basically it's got layers of charcoal in between the sort of fabric outer layer. The idea being that if chemical weapons or anything were used, as was thought Saddam Hussein had, which he didn't, we know that now, but if there was any chemical weapon attack, it would be one of the things that was there to protect your main body. And so I remember even in the training being sized up, and I think I was told I was a small or a medium or whatever for one of these suits, and so you get given a jacket and these trousers and you kind of punch your way through the stuff because it's all kind of compressed down. And the trousers have these braces that go over your shoulders. And so you tie everything up and you put it, and you sort of put it all together. And then you're told, right, you need to leave that on. You can't take it off. And then you're like, but I can't go to the toilet because it's got to fly.
God.
But I'm going to have to take, and I can't undo I can't undo the braces without taking the jacket off. So to go to the toilet, I have to take all of this off. So let's hope I don't have to do that in an environment that's
In a chemical warfare
environment. And also because you just think, oh, I'll just piss myself. It would be fine. And then they're like, no, you can't do that because if it gets wet, then it's deactivated. I was like,
oh crikey. If there was ever a moment for a shiwi, that is absolutely the time.
That was it. Yeah.
Oh my
goodness.
So
it was a very strange situation. I remember getting washed, when there were solar showers and that kind of thing that people had, those kind of bags that you see people using them camping and stuff. So there were ways to wash, but there wasn't any privacy. And because you're trying to maintain this relationship with a bunch of guys who I didn't want to give them any excuse to humiliate me, or to, not so much to take the piss, because soldiers take the piss all the time. Journalists take the piss all the time. But it wasn't so much about teasing. I was like, I'm not giving anyone an opportunity to think less of me or to look down on me or anything like that. I was like, I'm just going to play it sort of straight the whole way. So I was like, I'm not just going to whip my kit off and use one of the solar showers. Even when there was one point that where I was staying, there was a bus stop near where the soldiers were camped up. And someone had kind of got some tarpaulin and bungeed it around this bus stop, and that had become where people had the solar showers. But there was no door, there was no cubicle, there was no, people could just walk around the other side and see you. And a couple of people were like, oh, are you going to have a shower? And I was like, no, I'm not, because I'm not getting my kit off and going around there because I know what you're all going to do. And so you end up kind of washing with all your clothes on, which causes a lot of kind of interesting wet patches, but it dries fast when you're in the desert. So that's all right, I suppose. And wet wipes are great. But it had some moments, and I was still at some points bleeding, even though taking the pill back to back. And so there was a point where a level of privacy had been made. This is several weeks into the war, and tarpaulins had kind of been strung up around latrine, like a trench that had been built, and a toilet, sort of makeshift toilet, had been constructed using a plastic, outdoor chair. And as I sat down, I realized, the privacy only worked if you were a man, because if you're peeing and turning around, it was fine, but I was facing out the other way. And I was being watched because I could see the binoculars hovering.
Oh.
And I realized that I was bleeding as well. And so you kind of think, I don't know what to do in this situation. Like, nothing in my life has prepared me for what I do in this situation.
Oh,
Apart from just hold your head up and keep going.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask, like, did you feel when you were around those soldiers, did you feel like you were welcomed, or because of your job, did you feel like they were wary of you because of what you might report on or what you might say?
Yeah. I think there was I definitely got the impression that nobody wanted the journalist with them. That was even before I was out there. Because initially I was told that I was going to be with I think it was initially I was going to be with the Royal Marines, then I was going to be with the Parachute Brigade, then I was going to be with a different bit of the infantry, and then finally I was with this group called the First Fusiliers. That's their proper name is the First Battalion Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. And when you keep getting told something different, it kind of makes you think that somebody along the line's been saying no here. Royal Marines, no, we're not having a woman. No, we're
It's
not
like a
having
hot potato.
Yeah, exactly. And so I got to the point where the First Fusiliers sort of took me in, and I have to say they were lovely. The guy who met me, I'm actually still in touch with him, but he was sort of kind of the media liaison kind of guy, which I guess is not a job anybody wants anyway in this situation either. But he was very friendly, and the guys who I sort of rocked up with, who I was going to be living in this warrior with, the little tank, they had actually set me up a little tent out to the side so that when we were in Kuwait and when we were all kind of beginning to get to know each other, I did have a little bit of privacy in terms of where I was sleeping, which I thought was very thoughtful of them, actually, because they were at that point, 6 days away from a war starting. And
Mm.
and this is the thing, that having a journalist with you is a drain on your resources. Whenever we went somewhere, I knew who the kind of nominated person was who was there to watch my back. But then, of course, they were trying to watch their own back at the same time. So it is a drain on their resources. But yeah, they were incredibly kind and made a lot of effort to make me feel welcome and to have a bit of a laugh with. And yeah, and to just kind of get on with, because it is a difficult situation and you do sometimes have to report things that are tricky, and some things that were tricky to do. So I ended up taking out of Iraq. Like, I did the interviews when I was there and I didn't report them while I was there. I reported them when I was out.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much from the perspective of upsetting any of the guys, but more things that would upset the Ministry of Defence.
Mm. Yeah, it's a tricky one. You also wrote about the sort of stark contrast of being there and then coming home and trying to readjust to normal life again and just feeling a nothingness about it. And it reminded me of that scene in The Hurt Locker, where he comes back and he's in the supermarket just amongst like that giant cereal aisle, and just feeling like, what's the point?
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
It was a bit like in The Hurt Locker. I mean, I remember watching that and thinking, oh my God, I haven't seen that portrayed in the way that it felt like in my head. Yeah, I think that's actually in a lot of ways, a really excellent film about war. I got back and initially things were fine. And a lot of my colleagues sort of said, oh, you seem to have had a great war. As in, I'd sort of, I suppose, done all the things that they'd hoped might be able to happen. I was the furthest forward out of any of that particular company's reporters at the front line, which was not my making. That just happened to be the bunch of people I was with. It had been very successful from the perspective of being a reporter. I'd always managed to get stuff out. I'd been using my satellite kit and all of that had been fine. And one of my colleagues, I remember, remarked that I always sounded upbeat whenever she was on the phone to me, which had surprised her. She's like, I thought you'd be scared or whatever. And I was like, well, no, fine, carry on. And then I got home, and the first thing that happened was that I went on holiday. We were sort of enforced, you must take some leave now. So I went to Sri Lanka with my then boyfriend, he's now my husband, but we went away for a holiday. And we're staying on the beach, and it was, one of those beautiful places. The only thing I'd said to him, because he booked it all, I was just like, I just want to sleep in a bed, because I haven't slept in a bed for
He's
weeks.
like, great, that's very,
I'm on
very
it.
easy to
No,
achieve.
no piss of cockroaches, no cement floor in a police station, no, it's just like, can I just, I don't want to sleep under a Warrior, I don't want to sleep under a Land Rover, I don't want to sleep on sand, can I just sleep in a bed? He's like, yeah, on it. And so we ended up in Sri Lanka, and we were staying at this beautiful hotel on the beach, and it was quite fancy. I was like, oh, this is great. And it was one of those places that there was a little handwritten note saying, come down to the beach for, the manager would like to welcome you with complimentary cocktails, whatever. I was like, sure, I'm in. And so I slightly struggled with getting ready, because I, did my hair, and I got dressed in clothes that I had like a wealth of choices, rather than just like war reporter gear. I put makeup on, and and it all kind of felt like, oh, these are how the gears turn. Like, I'm getting back into being like a normal human again. And we went down to the beach, and it was one of those moments where everything collided, where my foot, wearing just sort of sandals, touched the beach. And it was the sand. I could feel the sand going in between my toes. And that in itself was fine. And at the same time as my foot hit the sand, there was a huge explosion. And I was on the ground, because you get on the ground, Mother Nature protects you. And I sort of realized that the explosions were continuing, but also that Lee, my boyfriend, was still standing. And I was like, what's going on? And he sort of helped me up. And it was fireworks on the beach. And so that was kind of an initial like, oh, maybe things are not all okay. And a bit of a red flag. But I'd heard stories about this from some of the soldiers, about how they got back from, wherever, and then they're walking down the street, and the next thing they know, they're being pulled out of a hedge, like one of their mates is pulling them out of a hedge because a car's backfired. And so I thought, oh, maybe it's just a, kind of a lingering little bit of that. The training's still there. It's kind of good that it kicks in, I suppose. And over the next few months, things sort of loosely fell apart. I stopped really doing anything at home that was helpful without realizing it. So like, I stopped doing laundry. I wasn't able to do things like go out to the supermarket, really do anything like cooking or cleaning, or I sort of stopped doing a lot of things, although I wasn't really aware of that at the time. And things kind of came to a head by about June. I think I got back at the beginning of May. June, July, things really began to fall apart, and I had a really bad day at work and ended up crying. And I remember my editor at that point saying, I think you need to see someone. And so work was very good. They had a psychiatrist and a psychologist that I ended up seeing. And so I saw him, and I had talking therapy with him for quite a large amount of time, and antidepressants and anti-anxiety. And my diagnosis was of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So it's quite the combination. And the strange thing was that I was able to, and I'm actually quite thankful, I'm very thankful for this, I was able to keep working. So he, the psychiatrist, supported me to carry on doing my job. I think if I hadn't carried on doing my job, that would have been really untethering. And I think that might have been a very bad outcome. Because lots of people kind of like, how did you keep doing this when you were feeling like that? The thing was that when I was in a war zone, or a post-conflict or a disaster zone, I was actually competent in a way that I wasn't in normal life. So I was able to do my job and do it well. I was very calm under pressure, which is sort of one of my superpowers, I suppose. I was able to keep processing information and keep doing stuff even when the bombs were dropping all around me. Get me back home in London 10 minutes late for an appointment because I'm stuck in traffic, and I would be in floods of tears and couldn't cope. But out there on the edge of the cliff, on the extreme, I could absolutely do it and hold it together. I still have a slightly strange stress response, I think, as a result of that, and I probably always will. But then these things make you what you are.
Yeah.
Mm.
And you kept going back to war zones, and you also covered disaster zones. So you covered the earthquake in Pakistan and the Boxing Day tsunami in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And you talked about in the book there were situations where women seeing you as the only woman who was around who was coming in with aid, trying to grab you and pass their babies to you. And Boxing Day tsunami, just seeing the worst destruction of human life. How did you manage to sort of reconcile yourself with that emotionally and cope with experiencing those things and not be in a position to really do anything to help?
I mean, alcohol, probably. I mean, I don't mean that in a flippant way, but I remember coming back from the tsunami, one of the big days of the Pakistan earthquake disaster relief coverage that I was doing, and I'd flown into Muzaffarabad, which was the city that was kind of the hub for the relief operation. I'd flown in and out of there, I think about 4 times. Might have been more, might have been less. I'm not quite sure, but doing this on these huge helicopters that were absolutely laden with food, medical supplies, tents, like all the things, and flying through the most jaw-dropping, beautiful, like awe-inspiring scenery that I think I've ever seen. But then landing, seeing the buildings that are just completely pancaked, and it had struck it early in the morning, like early during the working day, like 9 o'clockish, I think. And so knowing that all these buildings that you were landing around that had pancaked would have had people in them, the schools and the hospitals and the workplaces, and seeing the tent city that was kind of springing up around the rubble. And usually it was all men. I think it was almost all men on the flights, the people manning the helicopter, the people who were actually loading and unloading, and a lot of military people involved. I mean, I was seeing what the British military were doing. They were flying in. But then when you got on the ground, it was Pakistan military that were taking stuff off the aircraft. And then every time the helicopter would be readying to go back to Rawalpindi, which is where the military base was that aid coordination was kind of coming out of, there would be a big crowd of people, inevitably, who were there to help with taking all the stuff off. But then they would kind of surge often towards the helicopter, which is also not very safe. And so there were people, Pakistani soldiers, that would kind of hold the crowd back, not in a very gentle way, I have to say. But almost always there would be a woman who would grab hold of me and try to give me their baby. And it could be anything from a tiny little baby, like babe in arms, to a small toddler. And they would be talking to me, and I didn't understand the language they were talking. And all I could say was, I can't, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And even now, just thinking about it kind of gives me the chills. But
That's so hard.
and then you'd fly through this extraordinary scenery back to Rawalpindi and then do it again and do it again and do it again. And I remember at the end of that night, just getting back to by the time I got into a Land Cruiser or whatever to take me back to where I was staying, I couldn't even talk to anybody anymore. And getting into where I was staying and just listening to music on repeat, which is something that I sort of do, that I've always done, which I suspect is somewhat autistic trait there. It's part of a sort of self-soothing thing that I think I unconsciously do. And just listening to music on repeat and on repeat and on repeat, and drinking and crying, because I didn't have words. I still, like, it's 19 years later, I still don't really have words to tell you how you make sense of that. I don't think you can make sense of that. I think it's an awful situation. It's, yeah, the ultimate disaster, right? But people who are wanting the best, and you kind of think, oh my God, if the best that you can think of is to get your child out of here, to give it to a stranger, I see where that's coming from, but I can't make sense of that. That's just, it's unfathomable. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, God, that's so confronting. And I guess you're right. It's just something that you have to sort of sit with, don't you? There's no, Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
That's really hard.
Yeah. It was really hard.
And
I mean, it's the kind of thing I talked about with the psychologist, and on and off I had not necessarily nightmares, but very vivid dreams about a lot of this kind of stuff. And so your brain just, somewhere along the line, you process it, and you have to process it. Otherwise, I think it would just take you over. It would engulf you. Yeah.
absolutely. Something else in your book that as I read it, truly I felt a visceral rage come over me. And that was it was after the birth of your son
Mhm.
and the treatment that you received.
Mm.
And honestly, I was just so angry for you. But the sad thing is that you're not alone with that sort of treatment. So can you explain to the listeners a little bit about what went down there?
Yeah. So I had my son 15 years ago in the UK, in London, and the pregnancy and birth were largely straightforward. And the thing I had sort of struggled with across the pregnancy was I didn't feel a huge amount of connection with my belly, with what was going on in my body. And I kind of thought that's okay because, birth must be the bridge that you cross from one thing to the next, right? And so it will make sense. And I remember lying initially in the room in the hospital that I had him in, and looking out towards Hampstead Heath, which is this big, gorgeous, kind of slightly wild park in London, and looking out that way towards the window and not looking at the little baby in the little plastic cot next to me, and feeling quite disconnected and not really knowing how to make sense of that. But then I'd never had a baby before, so you kind of think, well, it's all new, isn't it? And I was bleeding a lot, and we ended up having to stay in hospital for a couple of days because my son got jaundice, and so he was having the light therapy, and all of that's very kind of straightforward. Um, but I was still bleeding like big clots of blood, and the situation then in London was that basically you didn't have a. It's not like here where you have a lead maternity carer and you have like a midwife who's your point of contact, who you get to know over, the months that you're pregnant, who you see at so many of your appointments, who is there at the birth. It's a really different system. So I never saw the same midwife twice when I went for the checkups. And I had a shift change in the middle of my labor, even though it was only a 6-hour labor. The midwife who I started with was not the midwife who I finished with. And so then in the hospital, you never see the same midwife twice on the ward. And so at about day 2 or 3, when we went home, I was still bleeding really, like really, really heavily. And the advice was, if you're getting clots that were bigger than a 50p piece, which I guess is like $2 coin sort of size here, then tell your midwife. So I was telling all these midwives that I was bleeding really badly and I had these really big clots. And I actually even, because I am perhaps too familiar with bodies, I kept some of them for one of them on a paper towel. I was like, look, here are my clots. And she kind of like recoiled away from them. And I was like, well, you don't listen to me when I tell you, so I'm going to show you what they look like. And kept being told, it's normal, it's normal, it's normal. And I kind of thought, well, it's not what your leaflet tells me is normal, but sure. And breastfeeding was a car crash. Like I couldn't do it. I didn't understand how to get him to latch on. He didn't seem to suckle very hard. I just found breastfeeding almost impossible. And I was taught how to breastfeed, antenatal classes, but it's never from the right perspective, because you kind of need to be taught from that perspective.
From there down.
Yeah.
But you never get taught that way. You get taught looking at somebody, and it's like, that doesn't work. I want a video to see what it looks like from that direction. Anyway, maybe
Because there's a lot going on with the position of the mouth and everything.
Yeah.
It's very complicated.
Bit of the nipple you're putting them on. Of course, your boobs are completely different, and your nipples look like these kind of aliens have grown on your chest. Like, it's so weird. Everything's weird. And I was just finding it incredibly hard. And, we went home, and so a midwife came every day, and a different midwife came every day to weigh my son. And he was losing weight, which was not initially that much of an issue until we got to about day 9, I think. And he had lost more than 10% of his birth weight. And it was a midwife appointment that had happened at about 5:30 in the afternoon. And the midwife she looked at him and sort of said, I'm not really worried about him, but he has lost more than 10% of his birth weight, which is there's a trigger point. And that was the point that, I should probably back up the truck actually and talk a bit about the pediatrician. By the time my son was 9, I already didn't have a great experience with pediatricians, because when he was 11 hours old, we were still in the hospital. I can't now remember why, but he had to have some blood tests done. And he'd been a very sleepy baby initially. And I remember saying to a midwife, he's just sleeping. He doesn't seem interested in doing anything else. And I remember her saying to me, oh, well, some babies are sleepy, especially, if you've had pethidine in the labor. And I was like, yeah, but I didn't have pethidine. And she was like, oh, well. And so anyway, he hadn't fed. And I can't remember why he had to have these blood tests, but he saw a pediatrician when he was 11 hours old. And she said, when did he last feed? And I said, well, just after birth, because he's been sleeping ever since. And the midwives have told me to leave him, just leave the baby to sleep. And she absolutely turned on me and said, if you won't feed him, we will. And I was standing there like in my hospital gown, tied up the back, and everything about your body is just like all over the
It's like the most vulnerable.
The most
you just
vulnerable.
feel, yeah.
I was like, literally, I'm in my slippers in the hospital gown, and she says to me, if you won't feed him, we will. And it was like being slapped. I was just
the
like,
implication of those words that
Yeah.
That you're
were
holding
choosing
back.
not to
Yeah.
feed your baby.
I can't believe you're already neglecting your child, you fucking bitch.
Oh my
And I was just like, what?
Oh my God.
And I just started to cry because everything's leaking out of everywhere by this point. And we got home, we got to this situation where he was losing weight. And so I was told, you're going to have to go in and see a pediatrician. And I was like, oh my God, not that pediatrician. And I said, do I need to take him in now? And the midwife said, no, I'll write you a letter. Take him in tomorrow morning. She rang the hospital. She made an appointment for 9 o'clock the next morning. And she said, just give them the letter. It'll all be fine. Don't worry. And so I didn't think very much more of it. I went to the toilet that evening at about 7 o'clock, or maybe it was slightly later actually. I think it was after we'd had dinner. Went to the toilet, and as I was standing up from going to the toilet and pulling up my pants, I had this huge gush. And I looked down, and the bathroom looked like a crime scene. There's blood. Like there's blood everywhere. There's blood on my jeans. There's blood on the floor. There's blood on my shoe. There's blood everywhere. And I started shouting. And the person who was first into the bathroom was my dad, who is a doctor and has also been an army medic. So in a way, was probably the best person to have got there. But it's the only time I've seen right round the irises of my dad's eyes. His eyes, just like I saw the whites of his eyes, literally. And I was like, oh, if you're scared, I should
This
be
isn't good.
This is not good. And he said, you need to go to A&E now. You need to get to the hospital. So I went to the hospital. So Lee and I, my husband and I, and our little baby in the car seat went to A&E, and I was scanned. So this is day 9 postpartum. And they said, oh, you've got retained placenta. I was like, what is retained placenta? They're like, oh, not all of the placenta was got out of you at the birth. I was like, okay, so what does that mean? And they said, well, basically, we need to take it out, but we can't do that tonight. You need to come in tomorrow morning and we'll do it. And I said, I can't do it tomorrow morning. I've got to go to the pediatrician because my son's lost over 10% of his body weight. And they said, okay, well, we'll do it the day after that then. So I go home. I have, I think, 2 hours sleep if I was lucky that night. I got to the hospital the next morning with my son to see the pediatrician about the losing weight. And she came around the corner into the cubicle and like didn't say hello, didn't introduce herself. It was a different pediatrician to the last one I'd seen. And she said to me, why the hell was this child not brought in last night?
Mm.
And I said, oh, like I just started crying again. And my dad, thankfully, was with me. And he was an absolute legend that day because he had been sitting, in the hospital chairs. We've both been sitting there. And he just stood up and put out his hand and he went, Dr. John Ferguson, nice to meet you. I'm Susie's dad. And it just like cut it out from underneath her. And I'm not normally one for like pulling women down, absolutely not. But I just thought it was one of those moments that just changed the framing. And he was like, so what do we need to do? She was like, well, he needs to have these blood tests done. He'll have these very high levels of potassium and sodium and stuff. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. Like, is that bad? I assume it's bad, but I don't know in what way. And Dad just said, we'll do the tests and then we'll get the results and we'll go from there. She was just like, okay, and stormed off kind of thing. But yeah, I had retained placenta, which actually was never dealt with in the end for a bunch of probably slightly boring reasons, but it did finally come out about 8 weeks later. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
gosh.
What a ride.
And
what a ride.
There was a moment where you were sitting next to someone waiting for an appointment and a woman knitting breasts.
Yes, I loved her so much. So
it was an incredible moment.
Because I'd been trying to get an appointment with a breastfeeding counsellor and hadn't been able to. And I was in the waiting room. It was actually when we were waiting for these blood tests to come back from the lab with my son at that 9-day point. And she just started chatting to me in the waiting room and she was going, oh, isn't your baby lovely? All this kind of stuff. And I was like, I really like your breasts, because there was something kind of surreal. And like she had a whole bag of them. She was knitting while we were talking, but also she had this whole bag of breasts of different colors and like different skin colors and different nipple colors and the bigger ones and smaller ones. And it was just like everyone could find their breast in her bag. There was just something kind of slightly anarchic about it that I really enjoyed. And yeah, I told her the story. I've got this retained placenta, my son's losing weight, and we don't know what's happening with him, and if we had to have these tests, and I don't know what to do, and I can't breastfeed him properly. And she just basically did a counselling session with me there and then. And she said, oh no, she got me to put him on. She was like, no, you've got a good latch. This, it's not a tongue tie situation or anything like that. And she went, but if you have retained placenta, you haven't had a proper hormone switchover from being a pregnant woman to being a breastfeeding mother. She was like, that's why he's losing weight, because your body's not producing enough. But there's this real kind of, or at the time as well, there was this real kind of thing about, breast is best and anything else was substandard and all this kind of stuff. And it was actually my dad, the doctor, who went out and bought the formula and just went, just feed him. Just feed it. It's not poison. Just feed him it. And so he was mixed fed till he was 13 months old. I fed him for a long time, but yeah, it was not a straightforward outcome. And then you get the shame, like that we talked about at the beginning, where you're like, oh, I'm not, I'm okay. I achieved the natural birth, like, well, hey, like whatever that means, but I can't feed him myself. So I'm inadequate. So I'm no good at this mothering. So I can't do this.
It's so hard in the beginning when you become a mother. There's so much going on mentally, emotionally, physically. And I remember having feeding difficulties in the beginning with my son, and that very quickly the voice inside your head is going, you're failing as a mother. This is the one thing you're supposed to be able to do, and you can't even do it. You can't even feed your baby. And like, we couldn't be meaner to ourselves in that moment when we feel the most vulnerable. And to then think how bad that was. And I had supportive professionals around me, but to be cut down by so many people in that moment, it just was brutal. It was hard to read. But then having that incredible chance encounter with a woman with a bag of breasts who was literally seemed like the only person who said something helpful and informative and supportive to you.
She was, actually, because I ended up kind of put into this regime of having to take my son for kind of more checkups than you'd normally have to, in that sort of up to the well, I can't remember what point it was, but it's a different system in the UK. You have basically a midwife comes and sees you for the first 2 weeks, and then you go into a system where you see what's called a health visitor, which is like a nurse that specialises in infant care. So it's not the same as here where you have the same midwife again right way through the process to the 6-week point. And so I was having to have 3 checkups a week rather than 2 checkups a week, which is what most babies have with the health visitors. And every time he was told, like, you have to put on 100 grams, you have to put on however many grams in the before we see you again. And I just got into this absolute blind panic where I would feed him myself. I would feed him with a bottle. I'd top him up with a bottle. I would then be like ready to go instantly when he would literally, I could get nothing more into him before he weed. To get him to get him to be weighed. And he never put on the requisite amount of weight. And so every time I was then like, oh, nearly, but you're 5 grams short.
Oh God, so stressful.
And so it was so stressful that I'd literally be running down the road to try to get him in while I'm still bleeding, to get him in to be seen, to kind of to hit the target, and I never hit the target. And so when you don't hit the target enough times, I'm sure I was flagged as like, oh, unfit mother, watch this one, neglectful. Yeah.
And it's like all you need in those situations is you need a supportive, validating voice, like if they had said, oh, he's 5 grams short, but you're doing a great job. Like this is not your fault, let's figure out a plan together. That's what we need rather than this feeling of constant failing. It's horrible.
Yeah. Constant failing is horrendous. And I mean, I who knows what the outcome would have been another way, something else had happened. But it gave me the very strong sense that I wasn't good at being a mother. This is not your forte. This was not something that you maybe thought you were going to be a great mum and that you were going to love it. Turns out you suck. So, that kind of message from my perspective as well was like, this is not a thing you are good at. If you want to go and do things that you're good at, maybe you should go back to work. And I mean, I'm not for a minute saying that was a bad thing to do, because I think in a lot of ways it made me a better mum going back to work. But yeah, I suppose I didn't anticipate, it didn't cross my mind that people wouldn't be supportive. And yeah, turns out people were not. Yeah.
You talked about the struggle to, feel maternal and enjoy that early baby time. And I was so glad that you talked about that, because it's not talked about enough. I think there's this assumption the baby will come out, suddenly you're an earth mother and you love every moment of it. It wasn't my experience. But yeah, I thought that was so important to talk about, because again, you judge yourself when you're like, wait, is this it? Shouldn't I like this more? Why was it important for you to speak about that?
I had a colleague in the UK who was the only person who said this to me. And I think her advice was everything at some points for me. She kind of sidled up to me. She was an older woman. I think she was probably in her 50s at the time. And she had 3 kids. But she kind of sidled up to me at the morning tea for when I was going away on maternity leave. And very quietly just said, don't worry if you don't love them straight away. I didn't love any of mine. And she had it, and I knew her quite well. We'd been colleagues for a number of years at this point, and I knew how much she loved her then teenage children, and how well she got on with them, and how much fun she found them, and family was a really big deal for her. And she was the only person that said that to me. The only bit of messaging, like from an individual or sort of from society, because from society you get the kind of earth mother, loving every minute type thing. And when I didn't love my son when he was first born, and didn't love my daughter when she was first born either, some years later, I've always remembered her voice in my head saying that, because I think, again, it's part of this, it's part of this silence and shame, that if you don't, like, what do you do if you don't love your baby straight away? Well, I didn't. He's now 15 and I love him to bits. And my daughter's 12 and I love her to bits too. There's so many kind of sticks you can find to beat yourself with around early motherhood. And I feel like we need to, the more we talk about this kind of stuff, the more normal it becomes. You know, maybe someone listening to this will be like, oh, I don't love my baby either. Maybe that doesn't mean I'm a terrible mother. Yeah.
The book is brilliant. It's a massive undertaking to write a book. And, you know, through that you had to revisit the most crunchy experiences in your life. Did that feel cathartic for you to do that? Or did it bring up unexpected emotions as you went through that process?
Yes and yes. I found it quite difficult at points. It's interesting that you sort of picked up on the stuff with my son, because I wondered if people might pick this book up thinking the scary bit's going to be about the war, but I think the centerpiece of the book is my son and the aftermath of his birth. It was actually kind of amazing to have to give myself the time to do things like go back through my archive, lots of pictures and reports and stuff that I'd done from various different places, and it was kind of amazing to hear some of that and to see some of the pictures, because you know I have pictures in my mind's eye of what it looked like after the tsunami in Sri Lanka, but to actually flick through the pictures like I haven't done for a very long time was kind of amazing to do, because I look at them and think, yeah, it was as unbelievable as I remember it. And I still don't really, my brain still struggles to make sense of that stuff. You know, I just have one of those memories that kind of hangs on to tiny details. And so it was sitting and allowing myself to kind of drop myself back into certain places. Like, what was it like to be in the desert in the Iraq War? What do you remember about the textures, the smells, the sounds, the sensations, all of that kind of stuff was all tucked away in there, but it's not something that I have thought about on a daily basis for a long time. So that could be quite confronting. The thing that was the most confronting was writing about my son, and probably writing about the disasters, because they just sort of brought up quite a well of emotion. And I'm not sure that writing is therapy, but it's a companion to it perhaps, because it's given me perspective. You know, it's been a long time since some of this stuff's happened, you know, 15 years since my son was born and 20 years since the Boxing Day tsunami. And, you know, you kind of go back and you think, gosh, all of this stuff has happened a long time ago. But having the perspective and having the time to sit and do some of that work has actually been a real gift. I wouldn't necessarily have said that to you, you know, when I was working 7 days a week writing the book and working at RNZ, but it's helped to make sense of some things and to put things into some kind of context as well. And to some extent, make peace with some things. Yeah.
And so now that the book is out in the world, what do you hope readers take away from your story, particularly those who may be experiencing similar struggles, like with chronic illness or not feeling heard by the system?
Yeah, I hope people see that it is useful to keep talking about these things. It's the kind of thing that you can get very disheartened if you're kind of caught up in the medical system, I think, sometimes. And I mean, like I've said before, there are some amazing medical professionals out there. But I think it can feel very hard when you're coming up against, you know, as we know, this resourcing's pretty tight. People are pretty burnt out. It must be pretty hard working in the medical system now. And finding compassion for yourself and for others in that circumstance becomes so much harder, right? But I hope it's the kind of thing that people feel perhaps validates them and where they are. And sometimes you just need to be seen. Because, I mean, I didn't have any kind of blueprint for this. I don't know anyone else who was a war reporter who had endo, who was bleeding while they were out there. Maybe there were a bunch of them. I don't know.
It feels niche. It does feel niche.
Yeah. I suppose as well, perhaps it's affirming that you can be in the midst of the depths of depression and you can still find the thing that you're good at and the thing that makes you smile. And sometimes you just need to keep going. And I sort of wish that we didn't sometimes just have to keep going, but I haven't really come up with any better way of doing things sometimes. But I think it's one of those things that people talk about, you need to see it to be it and that kind of thing. And so I hope that people will take away from this that you can have things that really look like, if you have endo, maybe you shouldn't be doing this job or that job or whatever, but also maybe you should.
I love that.
Well, Susie, thank you so much for joining us. The book is fantastic. You've got a brilliant turn of phrase. It's really a real pleasure to read. The book is called Bloody Minded. It is out now, written by Susie Ferguson. And if people want to connect with you online or hear more from you, where can they do that?
I'm not a very online type of person, but you can find me at RNZ Susie, Susie is how you spell the Susie, on Insta.
Perfect.
Lovely. And we can listen to you on Saturday mornings, can't we?
You sure can.
Brilliant. Cool. Thank you so much for your time, Susie. We've so loved chatting to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your interest. It's been a real pleasure talking to both of you as well, so thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, and hope the book just goes amazingly well.
We'll
We'll
see.
Hugely proud. It's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. I am I am sort of astonished that it's been a thing. So yeah, delighted, and it's great to talk to you both. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Susie.
Cool. Thanks, Susie. Thank you for listening to this episode of Untidy. If you enjoyed it, we would really love your help to support us to continue to make the show. Things you can do that make a huge difference is subscribing to the show so you never miss an episode. You can also leave us a little 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And of course, please share this podcast with your mates. It means that we can continue to build this community, keep putting out untidy episodes, and just keep doing what we love to do.
And don't forget to check out mybigmoments.com for kids' books that make your tricky job of parenting just a whole lot easier. Untidy listeners get a discount at checkout, so just pop in Untidy for 10% off your order when you check out. And lastly, we would like to thank all of the good people that make this podcast possible: Flicker Williams and Joe Rocker at My Big Moments for the beautiful artwork and design, and Maxine London Creative for editing this episode. Thank you so much, guys. Take care. We'll see you soon. Mā te wā.